right, we are on now to Unit 11. So in this unit, we are back to North and Northeast Africa, and we're going all the way up until the 18th century. So you can see by the dates here, we're getting pretty close to the colonization of Africa. And so these last few units are really going to bring us all the way up to that point. So again, we're back to North and Northeast Africa, and continue on with that. We're going to be looking at, as they call it, the Arabization of Northern Africa. We already kind of started talking about this, talking about how Arab invasions were altering what was going on politically, economically, and socially in Northern Africa, and so that's going to continue here. From the 10th to the 13th century, it's mainly concerned with large-scale immigration from pastoral nomads, which coming from Arabia were known as Bedouins. They moved gradually over time out of Arabia and into Northern Africa. So if you look over on that map and you see where modern day Saudi Arabia is, that Arabian Peninsula is where they would be coming from. They in general lived a highly mobile life. They lived in tented dwellings and tended to move around nomadically as it was, and so moving around wasn't unusual for them. They were frequently on the move, herding their camels and their goats from one pasture land to another, and so in that regard, they slowly started moving into new territories in North Africa. Bedouins typically traveled in small, family-sized clans, and they had very little overall unity. They're really similar to the Berbers, which we talked about before in Northern Africa. When they settled, they sometimes disrupted agricultural communities that were already existing in the territories where they were settling in. But generally speaking, they were blamed for more chaos than they actually caused, and they have a negative connotation because of that. They were Muslim, but unlike a vast majority of Muslims, they were not literate. If you remember before when we talked about the last time we talked about the Muslim faith, we said that part of it is reading the Quran, and obviously you have to be literate to read the Quran. So it was very unusual that they were not literate, and so because of that, they were really looked down upon by literate Arab scholars. But still, despite this, they spread the Islamic language and culture throughout North Africa. So when we last left off in Egypt, we were talking about the Fatimid dynasty. So they are where we last left off. And initially, the rule of the Fatimids was pretty prosperous. They revived the Red Sea trade, and they made the Egyptian merchants very wealthy. And we talked about the Red Sea trade revival in regards to Ethiopia and other Eastern and Southern African countries in our last couple of chapters. So, not surprisingly, the Fatimid caliphs, those are the rulers of Egypt at the time, charged very heavy custom duties on all imports and exports. This is something we've talked about pretty much continually when we talk about the growth and the wealth of any given state. The main source of their government income, however, a little bit different than other regions that we talked about, is their heavy taxation on the peasantry. What they would do is they would have a collection of taxes that were leased to the Berbers. So the Berbers had by this point settled down in the role of like a settled aristocracy, and they were in effect the landlords over vast areas of the Nile Valley. So they had to pay an annual sum to the caliph, and they were free to keep any further taxes. And so because of this, they squeezed the peasants as hard as they could. You know, they want to be able to get the money that they owe the caliph, but they want some to keep for themselves. And so because of this, the Egyptian peasantry was pretty badly mistreated by the Fatimids and the Berbers, who were, again, kind of their landed aristocracy that was ruling over them and owning the land that they were farming. So the Fatimids had initially conquered Egypt with a small but effective Berber army. And as the Berbers settled down into their new roles as this new ruling elite, the caliphs start to resort to the importation of slaves to boost the ranks of the army, because the Berbers are no longer making up the bulk of their army, because they're settling down into this new role as the landed elite. And so the principal wing of their army was cavalry, and that would be soldiers on horseback. They were made up of free Berbers and Turkish slave horsemen known as Mamluks. So the Mamluks are going to be really significant, not just in the history of Africa, specifically Northern Africa here, but really the rest of Western Asia. They're definitely a significant group at this time. So if you ever take a class that's going to talk about like Western Asia at this time, you're going to hear about the Mamluks again. So their influence is not simply limited to North Africa. It's just that of course, is our focus here. So they make up the cavalry. So again, the cavalry are the people on horseback in non-military speak. The foot soldiers, i.e. the people not on horseback, were mainly made up of black Sudanese slaves imported from south of the Sahara Desert. And so their army, the Fatimids' army, are not ethnically the same as them. So they're almost like mercenary soldiers, like soldiers for hire, right? And so that's going to be significant when we talk about the loyalty of the army to the Fatimids. So over time, the Fatimid dynasty and their control over Egypt is going to start to decline. The government income from taxing the farming system is going to decline through corruption. Not surprising, because the fact that not only is a lot of it going to the caliph, but there's opportunity for the Berber aristocracy to take whatever they can. Wherever there's a source of money, there's going to be a source of corruption. So that starts to decline. And because their main source of income, they get some from taxing imports and exports, but most of it is coming from taxation on the peasantry. Because of this drying up, they are unable to pay their army. And the unity in the army starts to fall apart. Again, they're not from any one country. They don't have any sense of like national pride or ethnic unity. So there's going to be fighting in the army between the Mamluks, the Berbers, and the Sudanese soldiers. And this is going to disrupt trade and cultivation in the region and seriously weaken the Fatimids and their dynasty as a whole. By the 1160s, Fatimid Egypt is in danger of being overrun by Christian crusaders from Western Europe. If you remember from the last time you took a world history class or a Western Civ or anything, you probably remember talking about the Crusades, which are a series of military expeditions sent out from various European kingdoms, usually a coalition of different Christian European kingdoms, and they would go out and try to reconquer successfully or unsuccessfully, depending on the crusade in question, the Holy Land of Jerusalem. So in the 1160s, by the 1160s, I should say rather, they had actually had some success. They established the Christian kingdoms of Antioch and Jerusalem in the Holy Land. So they were successful at that point. There's going to be a lot of back and forth. That's a whole nother beast to conquer, the Crusades. But for our purposes, again, we're just going to kind of mention it really quickly. So there was an effort by the Crusaders to conquer Egypt, and that Christian conquest of Egypt was stopped by, he's famously known in the Western world as Saladin. That wasn't his actual name. His actual name was Salah al-Din ibn Ayyub, but again, everybody in the Western world calls him Saladin, so we'll call him Saladin because that's probably what you've heard of him as before. He initially was the leader of a small band of professional soldiers from Kurdistan, which is like to the east of Turkey. And he was an expert military genius. He reorganized the Egyptian army, declared a jihad, and expelled the Christian army from Egypt. Not only did he recapture Egypt, not only did he drive the Christian armies out of Egypt, he actually recaptured Jerusalem in 1187. By 1171, the last Fatimid caliph had died, and Saladin himself becomes ruler of Egypt, and he founded the Ayyubid dynasty. And if you look over to the right, you can see the extent of that dynasty. It's not only Egypt, but also going into the Middle East as well. This dynasty is going to return the government of Egypt to stability and prosperity, and it's also going to bring the Egyptians back to a more orthodox Sunni Muslim faith. He reorganized the army. He revived the regular importation of Mamluk slaves from Turkey as well to try to bolster the army in Egypt. So the Mamluks, again, are a very highly trained military force. So what they would do is they would take these young boys from different parts of the world, mainly like southern Russia. If you look over there to the map on the right, you can get a sense of what I'm talking about here, like southern Russia, Turkey, Syria, that region. So they'd take these young boys, and essentially these young boys would be slaves. And there's a whole system behind it. Again, we don't have the time to really get into the specifics of it, but if you were interested and you wanted to look it up on your own, it is pretty interesting. They had a whole system behind how they would have these boys, and they would train them and indoctrinate them with the Muslim faith. And so they're slaves, but they're also soldiers. And if you were a successful soldier, you could eventually earn your freedom and become a military commander. And so many of them did, and they became a new military and landed aristocracy. And the most powerful among them could earn titles, specifically the title of Emir. By 1250, they are powerful enough to start challenging the authority of the Sultan in the Ayyubid dynasty. They are going to actually murder the last Ayyubid Sultan and take over in essentially what is a military coup d'etat. And two different Mamluk dynasties are going to rule Egypt for the next 250 years. So this group of people who initially started out as slaves are going to eventually control Egypt and establish a dynasty. So the Mamluks are going to form a very powerful military dictatorship. It's not surprising that the military should be their focus, considering the origins. The army was constantly strengthened by the importation of new Mamluks from Turkey and southern Russia. Again, if you want to refer back to that map to look at the source of where these soldiers are coming from. This dynasty was not limited to Egypt as well. It extended into Western Asia, into Palestine and Syria. Eventually, they're going to defeat the Asian Mongols and the Fourth Crusade, and thus strengthen Egypt's claim as the intellectual center of Islam. The Mamluk protection extended over the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, though they didn't outright control them. And Cairo, being the capital of Egypt, is going to become the regular stopping point for pilgrims who are going on their way to the holy city of Mecca. So part of the Muslim faith is that you have to make a pilgrimage to Mecca. And so Cairo becomes a stopping point for many North African Muslims who are on their way to. So, as we mentioned just a couple slides before, the wealth of all Egyptian dynasties was really underpinned by the productive capacity of the Egyptian peasantry. And it has been since really the beginning of Egyptian civilization. This has been the source of wealth, even if we go back to the Egyptian pharaohs. So it's no surprise that it's going to continue here. So these farmers are going to be the hereditary holders of small family plots in the Nile Valley. The productivity of these plots would be calculated in advance, and so the government would tell them ahead of time what they owed in taxes to the government. And if you were unable for whatever reason to pay your taxes, suppose you had a bad harvest, which happens in the course of farming, then you would be expelled from your land. So we know that they were heavily taxed. They were especially heavily taxed under the Mamluks. Not only were they heavily taxed and squeezed pretty much throughout time, but they also had to provide labor freely and on demand for any kind of public works project. Very similar to what was going on in ancient Egypt as well, where the farmers in off-planting seasons would have to participate in building projects such as the pyramids and the other tombs of the pharaohs. So the reputation of the Mamluk army was that they were reliant on the skillful use of horsemen with bow, arrow, and sword. And I have an artist's rendering there on the right of what they looked like at the time. So they were horsemen, they were cavalry. And they were very good at what they did. Unfortunately, they failed to take into account the development of firearms and cannons. And so by 1500, with the spread of gunpowder, their army is really out of date. And they're no match for this new military technology that is hugely significant in terms of military history. And they're especially not going to be a match for the modernized army of a new power that is emerging, and that power is the Ottoman Turks. So the rise of the Ottoman Turks as a world power can be dated from their conquest of Constantinople in 1453. They changed the name of Constantinople to Istanbul. If you know the song, you know that it went back and forth many times, but it becomes the capital of their very vast empire, and you can see the extent of that from the picture, the map over there on the right. By the end of the 16th century, it stretched across southeastern Europe, Western Asia, and Northern Africa as well. And they're going to be around for a long time. Egypt is going to be conquered by the Ottomans in 1517. By this point in time, they have lost their independence as an independent power, and they are now a province of the Ottomans, similar to their past history as being a province of the Roman Empire and the Greeks before that. The ruler of Egypt was now essentially a viceroy who was appointed from and answerable to Istanbul. By the 17th to 18th century, the hereditary Mamluk nobles had gradually regained effective power in Egypt. And so they're ruling Egypt with little to no oversight from the capital of Istanbul, even though they're technically part of the Ottoman Empire still. The heads of wealthy families at this time were known as beys. They were viceroys or pashas who were initially expatriate Turks appointed from Istanbul, but again, by the 1700s, the dynasties of pashas had been established, and they essentially operated independently from Istanbul. Egypt thus lacked the unity and the strength to fend off foreign invasions that are going to be coming in the future, specifically starting with the French under Napoleon in 1498. And continuing into the 19th century and the eventual partitioning of. So the spread of Islam through Lower Nubia is brought about by peaceful trading contact with Muslim Egypt. So we've just talked about the extent of the Muslim advances and the different Muslim civilizations that have taken control of Egypt. And the spread of the Muslim faith is thus going to start pushing south because we know there was much trade going on in this region in the Red Sea trade network. So the main process of Islamization, however, is going to begin in the 14th century. The southward pressure of Arab nomad pastoralist clans are going to start pushing into this region. By the 15th century, Arab nomads are pushing further south and west towards Darfur in the direction of Lake Chad. And as they go, they're spreading their religion, they're intermarrying with local population, and they are also raiding south of the Eastern Sahara to capture non-Muslim men and women to sell as concubines and slaves to Egypt and Western Asia, because it was against Muslim Sharia law for another Muslim to be a slave, and so they were looking for us non-Muslims as captives. So at the same time as the Ottoman conquest of Egypt is occurring, there is a new non-Arab power in Upper Nubia. It's the Funj Sultanate. The origins of this sultanate are pretty obscure, but they are probably from a group of pastoral people of the Upper Nile. By the 16th century, they extend control over the Nubian region between the Blue Nile as far south as the confluence of the White Nile, and by the 1600s they become Muslim due to that influence from the north from now Muslim Egypt. Early in the 16th century, Christian Ethiopia and Muslim Adal are going to be struggling for control of the Ethiopian highlands, and we've talked about the conflict between these two groups in previous units as well. And so, as is the case, anytime there is warfare, people are going to flee the battle zone because it's dangerous. And because there is a loss of any kind of organized power, there's going to be a power vacuum. And a group of people from the south, the Oromo, are going to come up into that power vacuum. And you can look over there on the map to the right, gives you an idea of where, in regards to Africa, we're talking about. So there's no single organized mass migration, and there's no overall central authority. This is kind of a piecemeal expansion of these people. During the early 16th century, their cattle herds underwent a rapid expansion, and so they needed to seek out new pastures, and they started moving into those regions that were abandoned by the warfare between Adal and Ethiopia. And so, depending on where they settled, depended on what religion they adopted. If they came more in contact with Adel, they were Muslim. If they went closer to where Egypt was in control, they became Christian. And by the early 1600s, the dominant population of the southern half of Ethiopia, they became the dominant population of the southern half of Ethiopia. The Christian kings of Ethiopia, however, in the late 16th century, paid little attention to the Oromo incursions from the south. They were concentrated on the northern half of their kingdom, but they are going to open up new trading contacts with the Ottoman Turks, the profits of which went mostly to the rulers, no surprise there. At the time, their principal export was captives. As many as 10,000 captives per year were sent out by the Ethiopian Empire. And the removal of so many people from the south in terms of their captivity is only going to ease the further expansion of the Oromo. So the major feature of this region, the Maghreb in the 16th century, is going to be a contest for control over the Western Mediterranean between Christian Spain and the Muslim Ottomans. So remember what the Maghreb is. Geographically, the Maghreb is, the word comes from the Arabic term the West. So we're talking about northern Africa, west of Egypt. So there's Egypt, and then that whole northern half to the west is the Maghreb. So what's going on here? There's going to be a jostling for control between Christian Spain and the Muslim Ottoman Empire. If you recall what's going on in Spain at this time, Spain has ended nearly 8 centuries of Muslim rule in southern Spain with their defeat of Granada in 1492. By the 15th, going into the early 16th century, the Portuguese and the Spanish were starting to seize ports along the North African coast, mainly for trading purposes, the most important being Tangiers, Algerias, Tripoli, and Tunis. So I have a map over here to the right of those cities that I just mentioned, again, significant trading posts. So Turkish corsairs, who are essentially pirates, who lived by the loot gained from attacking other ships, are going to start really patrolling this region as well. And they're going to respond by recapturing northern African ports from the Christian control of Spain and Portugal. And they are going to use them as raiding bases of Christian shipping. So anytime like the Spanish or the Portuguese would try to use the Mediterranean Sea to ship goods, and it was a major highway for shipping and trade at this time, these pirates would do what pirates do and try to take loot from them. And so Tripoli, Tunis, and Algiers, who controlled them is going to change hands many times, going back and forth between these groups. Tripoli, Tunis, and Algiers are all eventually going to become major Turkish bases for raiding during the 17th and 18th century, which is going to be a major headache for Christian Europe at this time. They become official provinces of the Ottoman Empire, but in reality, there really wasn't much control from Istanbul, similar to what's going on in Egypt. The loot from their raids provided a lot of wealth for coastal towns, and people benefited. They also benefited from the trans-Saharan trade, specifically the city of Tripoli. All the way to the very west of the Maghreb in the 16th century saw the rise of Morocco as an independent state. And there's going to be the rise of a nomadic clan that claimed descent from Muhammad's only surviving daughter, Fatima. And eventually they are going to be able to gain control of Morocco and to hold off incursions from both the Ottomans and the Portuguese. And so as Morocco rises as an independent nation, they're going to become pretty powerful. They're able to conquer the profitable kingdom of Songhay, which we talked about, in 1591, and they are going to develop a thriving trans-Saharan trade that's going to go out to the rest of the world, specifically with Elizabethan England, which was a political move because Elizabethan England, for a myriad of reasons, was Spain's great rival at the time. And so trying to kind of get back at Spain, their neighbor to the north, they did a lot of trade with England at the time. So thus ends Unit 11. Don't have much left. There is going to be 1 week in which we're going to have to combine 2 units later on, refer to the schedule. It is not next week. to get us back on track. But we only have up until Unit 15, so we are getting close to the end of our year of upheaval.